At 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time last Wednesday, MLB shut down as its 5-year collective bargaining agreement between owners and players expired. This has since become the league's 9th work stoppage, and it's a fight centered, spoiler alert, it's on money. It's mostly about money, but also about competitive balance. Spoiler alert. It's about money, but it's also about competitive balance. It's also about the number of games, postseason play, and more. Here with us today to discuss where the league goes next is Hannah Kaiser of Yahoo Sports. Hannah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I was just saying it's very cool when people care about baseball and care about labor for a little bit, because then I get to feel really important.
Well, I feel like labor, in general, labor issues are certainly rising to the top of mind of late in the world. So what is happening here? Walk us through what the concerns are from the players and why exactly MLB decided to lock the players out.
Yeah, so we're like 4 days into the first baseball work stoppage in 26 years. You'll hear that number thrown around a lot. That would take us back to the 1994 strike that canceled the end of the season, the World Series, the beginning of the 95 season. And that strike is why this is a lockout and not a strike. So since then, we've had quote unquote labor peace in baseball. But a lot of that is just because the owners have sort of been getting everything they want. They had a couple of really good CBA negotiations where they essentially, sorry to the Players Association, walked all over the union and managed to write into the CBA a bunch of stuff that they've sort of since been exploiting. Players are making their player salaries, like average player salaries, have gone down recently for like the first time basically ever since they got a union. Younger players are getting exploited. Older veterans are getting pushed out, that like middle class. And you keep seeing these like $300 million deals getting signed, but like that's the like extreme exception to the rule. Yeah. So things have been getting bad for the players for like 2 CBAs now. And we kind of saw this work stoppage coming. The reason it's a lockout and not a strike is because the owners learned their lesson in 94 not to let the players control the timing of a work stoppage. So they will never, this has been happening. So other sports know this better. So we've had lockouts in other sports since then, because basically management realized you should lock them out in the off season rather than start the season without a CBA, because that gives the players the power to go on strike sort of whenever.
Well, it's interesting because the past 2 years, the players union and the commissioner's office have had some public negotiations. It's been out there around how to play during the pandemic. And we've talked about even COVID, no one planned for it. So there wasn't a lot of ways to figure out how to do things. But how might those relations, specifically with Rob Manfred's negotiating history, affect negotiations this winter?
Yeah, so you talk about Rob Manfred, who actually led the negotiations for a lot of these really successful owners negotiations, because he was on the management side. It's interesting. He's actually, so now that he's the commissioner, he's sort of handed negotiations off. The key names to know are Dan Halem on management side. He's leading their negotiation. Bruce Meyer, who the union hired basically to be the muscle. He's like their lawyer who knows how to stand strong to management ahead of these negotiations. And we got to see those guys sort of clash over those COVID negotiations. And what we learned is that both sides would sort of rather dig their feet in than give an inch. And that was really interesting with the COVID stuff, because it really felt like, how can you not possibly come to an agreement? Early in like spring, summer 2020, there was this opportunity for baseball to be the only sport. Like all the other sports had stopped and they hadn't figured out when they were going to come back. And people were like, this is such a great opportunity. And they couldn't figure out. The most interesting thing that happened in that COVID summer was, so they sort of couldn't decide whether or not the players should have to take a pay cut, and the unions held strong and refused to take a pay cut and like literally left money on the table. So I don't remember what the exact numbers were. Don't cite this, but it was like the owners essentially offered them like whatever, 80 games at maybe like a 15% pay cut. And the players said, no, we won't take a single percentage less, but we'd rather play fewer games and make less money overall than play a game at not the full salary. So that's what ended up happening. Manfred had the power to institute a season unilaterally, but only if he was going to pay them sort of their actual rate per game. And he decided to do that. He implemented just a 60-game season, so they got less than they would have gotten. But it was a really interesting show of the fact that like this union, this sort of reinvigorated Players Association will not be pushed around. And the other thing that it really did, which could come into play, is like give the players, the like individual players themselves, not the union, a crash course in what a like de facto work stoppage looks like. They learned to sort of trade playing time and potentially even some money for the solidarity of saying these are our ideals as a union, a day's work for a day's pay, and we're going to sort of stand by them and stand together. And that's something that's really important because like when you think about the management, which is like 30 owners versus 1,200 players, it's a lot harder to get the players to sort of understand the labor stakes. And going into these CBA negotiations, COVID really provided an opportunity for them to, one, see that management would try to screw them over, and two, learn to stand together.
You mentioned the 94-95 lockout, which
strike. That one was a strike.
The strike, strike, which I think everybody, whenever you see, footage from the time, people talking about it, was, I think, fairly called disastrous. And most of the blame for that at the time, you can find outliers for this, but I think most of the blame for that at the time was laid at the feet of the players. They're selfish. These guys play a game. They make millions of dollars. Now they want more, yada, yada, yada. These crybabies, blah, blah, blah. And then coming on the heels of that, there was a lot of, oh, this soured me on baseball kind of discussions in various places. You mentioned that the owners have probably learned something from the last work stoppage. What about the players? What about the union in terms of trying to guide this conversation to a place where it's not, oh, these crybaby millionaires, look at what they want? Because it's, this is a fight in which they can't even agree on how much money MLB is making and where that money is going. They can't even agree on the basic figures. So has the union learned how to position themselves, how to frame this discussion going forward?
Well, they're sort of helped out in the sense that it's a lockout and not a strike this time.
Yeah.
You're seeing it in the way that Rob Manfred talks about it. So in the press conference he gave the day after the lockout, he was like, this is a defensive lockout. That is not a real term. That doesn't mean anything. But you can see that sort of that management was backed into a corner sort of by that 94-95 strike into realizing they had to act first. But in having to act first, that then puts Rob Manfred and the owners in the position of having to defend the work stoppage. I also just think people have learned, hopefully, maybe to be a little less critical of labor. That was the big difference, though, I think, is that so the 94-95 strike was over a salary cap. Baseball's the only major sport that I believe still does not have a salary cap. I know it still doesn't have a salary cap. I believe it's the only one.
Yes.
And that was a simple thing for people to rally around and to understand. And so obviously people were mad at the players. You talked about that. There were a lot of people who said they would never come back to baseball. Hopefully we don't have another steroid era to bring them back if that happens again. But the salary cap was an easy thing for people to understand. No salary cap. That had been the union's guiding principle since the Marvin Miller days, and it's still their guiding principle, and it's so much a part of what makes them the most powerful union in sports. It's also why we get those $300 million Bryce Harper contracts to offset the sort of pushing out of veteran and exploitation of younger players. I think the Players Association and the union's biggest issue in these negotiations is figuring out how to package and present what it is that, what's that line? What is the thing that you will say, we would never, or we have to get? What is the thing? There are certainly issues, and it's become increasingly complicated. The way that teams sort of manage to use pre-arb players and then players who are under team control within arbitration and all of that to sort of suppress salaries. But that's a tough message to get across. And that's going to be the union's biggest uphill battle, is getting across why it is that they've decided to sort of dig their heels in on this particular CBA negotiation.
Well, it's interesting because this negotiation, there's money is always always the reasoning. We've talked about this. Money is always what makes things shake. Either way, we heard a lot about the minor leagues. Does that come into play at all with this negotiation? Because some of the things that I heard going on with the minor leagues is pretty wild. Again, I'm not like super into MLB and everything in the workings, but does the minor leagues come into play in negotiations when you're talking this out right now?
No, not at all. It's a great question. And it's like far and away, I've heard it from all these people. Right. It's like the thing that people always say is like, oh, okay, so they're fighting for better conditions in the minor leagues. It's like, oh, no, absolutely not.
Oh my God.
No one is arguing on behalf of the minor leaguers. But it's interesting because it's like, that's the whole problem. The minor leaguers don't have a union, and that's why they get paid illegally low amounts of money because they don't have a union. So they're not part of this conversation. There is an interesting parallel happening, which is that like, in recent years, there have been sort of like advocacy groups that have like popped up around minor leaguers, like former minor league players and stuff. And they are not a union. And if you call them a union, they will correct you because they are not a union. But the mere threat of sort of labor organization, your workers acting in solidarity with one another has worked to achieve some progress. So the big thing going into next year will be that the league has announced that they're going to pay for minor league housing. This is like a huge win for minor league sports.
That's a big deal.
They've been sleeping in their cars. I mean, no bullshit. Like,
literally. And in addition to like not having enough money to pay for housing because they get paid so little, it's actually like a huge logistical hassle. And if you sign a lease somewhere and then you get promoted, then you're like suddenly on the hook for two. Like, it's a huge problem. Like, housing is such a big thing in the minors. And so it doesn't actually have anything to do with these CBA negotiations, but it is a good like reminder of why it's really important to have some level of organization as the labor, because like the owners will they'll pay you as little as they can, and then they'll only act when it seems like the workers are going to get together and sort of stand strong.
Obviously we've got months until the season starts, so they've picked their time frame quite carefully. Where do we go from here? Well,
I think that don't expect a lot of news this month. Mm-hmm. I think they once they've blown past the December 2nd deadline, it's not like they're going to hurry to get shit done in the next couple of weeks. So I think spring training. So everyone wants to know, are we going to miss games? That's what you were trying to ask. Are we going to miss games? And it's hard to tell, obviously. Spring training in particular creates like a weird sort of like a squishy deadline on the other end, because no one really knows exactly how long spring training needs to be. It's supposed to be 6 weeks. In 2020, they only did 3 weeks of what they called summer camp. Everybody says 6 weeks spring training too long, we don't need it. But then how long do they need? Do pitchers need to get ramped up? So we're probably not going to have anything happen for the rest of this year. And then hopefully talks will actually start to pick up again. The February is our most important month. So the takeaway is February is our most important month. If we're going to have everything happen on time, spring training, full spring training schedule, pitchers and catchers report mid-February, games start the end of the month. That's important because the towns of Arizona and Florida have missed out on now 3 spring trainings in a row if this gets disrupted. So if things are going to happen on time, it'll be that we get a deal in early February. If it starts to stretch into the rest of February, then we get into, okay, what's the minimum amount of time we got to give people? They still need to figure out, like, there's still free agents out there. How much time do we need to give everyone? Like, and I suspect that is actually where this will get decided, is that like January will wind down and we'll start to get into February. And then we'll start to see the two sides be like, well, we could be ready to go in 2 days. So if you want to accept the deal, and it's like, oh, no, we're ready. We're willing to push this a whole other week. Like, I think once we get into sort of who needs time in like February and March, then that's where they like get down to brass tacks in terms of like who's just posturing at solidarity and who's really willing to like let the season be on the line.
She's Hannah Kaiser, writer and reporter for Yahoo Sports. She's made stops with Deadspin, Vice, and Major League Baseball. Hannah, thank you for dropping the knowledge on us about what's going on, and thank you for joining Takeline.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I hope I didn't talk too much.
What? I needed that. It was a crash course.